He died to me 10 years ago. The words didn't just land in my ear, they detonated there, collapsing everything I thought I knew about grief, about family, about the son I had carried for 9 months and loved for 33 years. If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one. And you don't want to miss it. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed so hard against my skull I could feel my pulse throb against the plastic. The funeral announcement sat on the counter beside me, elegant script on cream cardstock that read, "In loving memory of David Clinton." I had spent 2 hours at the printer choosing the font. 2 hours picking words to honor a man who deserved 1,000 eulogies. And now, 48 hours before we were supposed to lay him in the ground, my only child, our only child, couldn't spare him even the dignity of showing up. "Michael, please," I whispered, hating how my voice cracked. "It's your father's funeral." Silence stretched across the line like a wound opening slowly. Then his voice came back, flat and final, as a door slamming shut. "I heard you the first time, Mom." My answer doesn't change. The call ended. No goodbye. No explanation beyond those 7 words that now echoed in the empty house like an accusation. "He died to me 10 years ago." I set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter, and looked at the framed photograph propped against the fruit bowl, David grinning in his fishing vest, Michael barely 15 beside him, both of them holding up a bass they'd caught at Lake Marion. It was the summer before everything started crumbling. The summer when my husband still believed discipline was love, and my son still believed his father's rules were negotiable. I remembered that day so clearly it hurt. Michael had spent the entire drive complaining about waking up at dawn, about the mosquitoes, about how boring fishing was compared to hanging out with his friends. David had just smiled that patient smile of his and said, "Son, sometimes the best things in life require you to sit still and wait." Michael had rolled his eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. Now, 20 years later, he had perfected the art of walking away. I touched David's face in the photograph, his laugh lines, the gray just starting at his temples, the gentle confidence of a man who believed he was doing right by his family. My throat tightened. How did we get here? How did the boy who used to fall asleep on his father's shoulder during car rides grow into a man who could dismiss his death with a single cold sentence? I had spent the last 3 days in a fog of shock and logistics, calling relatives, arranging flowers, choosing hymns David would have liked. The heart attack had been sudden, brutal. One moment he was trimming the hedges in our backyard, humming that old Johnny Cash song he loved. The next, he was on the ground, and I was screaming for someone to call 911. He died before the ambulance arrived. Died with dirt under his fingernails and the sun on his face, doing one of the ordinary things he did every Saturday because he believed a well-kept home was a form of love. The doctors said it was quick, painless probably, but there was nothing painless about the silence in this house now. Nothing painless about planning a funeral alone when you'd spent 35 years building a life with someone. Nothing painless about calling your only son and hearing him say the words that confirmed what you'd been too afraid to admit for a decade. He was never coming back. Not for Christmas, not for birthdays, not even for death. I sank into the kitchen chair, the one David always sat in for breakfast, and let the tears come. They were hot and furious, and mixed with something uglier than grief, something that tasted like rage. Because my son wasn't just mourning differently. He was punishing us. Punishing David for being the kind of father who said no. Punishing me for not taking his side every single time. And now, David was gone, and Michael's grudge had outlived the man it was meant to wound. I wiped my face with shaking hands and stared at the funeral announcement again. Beloved husband, devoted father, man of integrity. 3 lines to summarize a lifetime. And one of the people who should have mourned him most had already written his eulogy 10 years ago, not in words, but in silence, in absence, in a phone call that ended before it ever really began. I thought about calling Michael back, begging, explaining that whatever he thought David had done, death was supposed to erase it. Funerals were for closure, for letting go, for honoring the fact that someone had existed and mattered. But I didn't call. Instead, I walked into David's study, the small room off the hallway where he paid bills and read thick biographies of presidents and Civil War generals. I hadn't been in here since he died. It still smelled like him, old spice and leather and the faint tobacco scent from the pipe he'd quit smoking 20 years ago, but whose aroma had soaked into the wood anyway. His desk was neat, as always. Bills sorted, pens lined up, a half-finished crossword puzzle from Sunday's paper, his handwriting careful in blue ink. I pulled open the top drawer, looking for nothing in particular, just needing to touch something he had touched, to feel close to him in a world that suddenly felt unbearably empty. That's when I saw it. A locked drawer. Small. Built into the bottom right side of the desk. In 35 years of marriage, I had never known that drawer was locked. Had never thought to check. I pulled the handle. It didn't budge. My heart started beating faster. I searched the desk for a key, fingers fumbling through paperclips and stamps and receipts. Nothing. Then I remembered David's key ring, the one the hospital had returned to me in a plastic bag with his wedding ring and wallet. I ran to the bedroom, dug through my nightstand drawer, and found it. 5 keys. House, car, shed, mailbox, and one small brass key I'd never noticed before. Back in the study, I knelt in front of the desk, hands trembling as I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside the drawer was a stack of envelopes, maybe 20 of them, bound together with a rubber band. Each one had the same name written across the front in David's careful script. Michael. My breath caught. Letters. Letters my husband had written to our son. Letters that had never been sent. I pulled them out slowly, as if they might disintegrate in my hands, and stared at the dates scrawled in the corners. The oldest was from 11 years ago. The most recent just 3 months before David died. 11 years of words my son never read. 11 years of a father reaching out to a child who had already turned his back. I sat on the floor of that study, surrounded by the smell of old spice and loss, and opened the first letter with shaking hands. And for the first time since my husband died, I realized I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. The funeral home smelled like lilies and lies. I sat in the front row of folding chairs, staring at David's casket, polished mahogany with brass handles he would have thought too expensive, and felt the empty seat beside me like a missing limb. Michael's seat. The one I'd reserved in my head since the moment the doctor pronounced my husband dead. Around me, the chapel filled with voices, quiet murmurs, shuffling feet, the rustle of programs being opened and tissues being pulled from purses, David's colleagues from the hardware store. Our neighbors from Maple Street, my sister Diana, who'd driven down from Chicago and kept squeezing my hand like she could transfer strength through her palm. But the seat beside me stayed empty. I'd laid out Michael's suit that morning, the black one David had bought him for his college graduation. It hung in the guest room closet where it had been gathering dust for 8 years, still in the dry cleaning bag, the price tag tucked in the pocket because Michael had never bothered to wear it even once. David had spent $200 on that suit. He'd wanted his son to look sharp walking across that stage, to feel like a man stepping into his future. Michael had worn jeans and a wrinkled button-down instead. "It's my graduation," he'd said when David's face fell. "I'll wear what I want." That was the beginning, I think. Or maybe it was long before that. Maybe it started the first time David said no, and Michael heard, "I don't love you." "Beautiful service," someone whispered as they passed, squeezing my shoulder. I nodded, smiled the way you're supposed to smile at funerals, and felt my face crack under the weight of it. Because it wasn't beautiful. It was incomplete. Reverend Mitchell spoke about David's integrity, his commitment to family, his quiet generosity. He told the story about how David had helped rebuild the community center after the flood 3 years ago, working weekends without pay because that's what neighbors do. People laughed softly, nodded, dabbed at their eyes. And through it all, I heard the whispers. "Where's Michael?" "I haven't seen him." "Is he here?" "Lord, you'd think he'd show up for his own father's funeral." Each whisper was a knife, each glance in my direction, a question I couldn't answer without unraveling completely. "He died to me 10 years ago, Mom." Shame burned in my chest, hot and acidic. Shame that my son could be so cold. Shame that I'd raised someone capable of this kind of cruelty. Shame that people were noticing, judging, pitying me for the emptiness beside me. But underneath the shame was something sharper. Fury. Because David deserved better. He deserved a son who could put aside his pride for 1 day, 1 hour, long enough to say goodbye. He deserved grandchildren who would carry his name and his kindness forward. He deserved to die knowing his family was whole. Instead, he died trimming hedges in a backyard that felt lonelier every year. The service ended. People filed past the casket, touching the wood, murmuring prayers. Diana drove me home, talking softly about logistics, the will, the estate, whether I wanted to sell the house. I answered in monosyllables, my mind still stuck in that chapel, in that empty seat, in the moment I realized my son had chosen his grudge over his father's memory. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too full of David's absence. I wandered room to room, touching things: his coffee mug on the counter, his slippers by the bed, his reading glasses on the nightstand, folded carefully on top of a biography of Ulysses S. Grant he'd never finish. I ended up in his study. I'd been avoiding it since I found the letters, 20 envelopes bound with a rubber band, each one addressed to Michael in David's careful handwriting. I'd only read the first one before the funeral couldn't bear to read more. Not yet. Not while I was trying to hold myself together long enough to bury my husband with dignity. But now, in the 2 a.m. darkness, I needed answers. I sat at David's desk and spread the letters out in front of me, arranging them by date, like evidence in a trial I was conducting against my own ignorance. 11 years of words. 11 years of a father trying to reach a son who'd already stopped listening. I picked up the second letter, dated 9 years ago, and began to read. Dear Michael, I've started this letter 4 times now. Each time, I tell myself I'll actually mail it. Each time, I fold it up and put it in the drawer because I don't know if you'd even open it. Your mother asks about you every day. Have you heard from Michael? She says. Like if she asks enough times, the answer will change. I tell her you're busy with work, with your life, with all the things young men are supposed to be busy with. But the truth is, I don't know what you're busy with anymore. I don't know if you're happy or struggling or if you ever think about us at all. I replay our last conversation constantly. The things I said, the things you said. I should have listened more. I should have been gentler. You were 18 and angry, and I treated you like a criminal instead of my son who'd made a mistake. I wanted to teach you accountability. Instead, I taught you to hate me. Maybe tomorrow I'll find the courage to send this. Dad. My hands trembled as I set the letter down. The paper was yellowed at the edges, creased from being folded and unfolded, read and reread by a man who poured his heart onto pages his son would never see. I picked up the next one, then the next. Letter after letter, each one a window into David's breaking heart. Michael, I drove past your apartment yesterday. I didn't stop. I don't know if you'd even let me in. Your mom made your favorite pot roast tonight. She set a place for you at the table before she caught herself. I saw a kid at the store today wearing a baseball jersey like the one you had in high school. It made me remember teaching you to pitch in the backyard. You were so determined to get it right. That's the Michael I keep trying to reach, the one who didn't give up. Every letter ended the same way. Maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll be brave enough to apologize. Tomorrow I'll know the right words. Tomorrow he'll be ready to hear me. But tomorrow never came. I pressed my palm against my mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. This wasn't the man Michael described: the tyrant, the control freak, the father who cared more about rules than love. This was a man drowning in regret, reaching out across years of silence, begging for a second chance in words he was too afraid to send. David wasn't proud. He was terrified. Terrified of pushing Michael further away, terrified of saying the wrong thing again, terrified that any attempt at reconciliation would be met with the silence that eventually killed him, not the heart attack, but the slow death of hope that comes from loving someone who refuses to love you back. I thought about all the times I'd stood between them, softening David's edges, translating his discipline into language Michael could swallow without choking on resentment. Your father just wants what's best for you, I'd say after David laid down another rule, another expectation, another boundary Michael saw as a cage. He doesn't know how to show it, but he loves you so much. I'd spent years being the buffer, the interpreter, the peacemaker. But what if I'd been the problem? What if my constant interference had taught Michael that his father's words didn't matter, that he could always run to me and I'd smooth everything over, make the hard things soft, turn consequences into suggestions? What if I'd coddled him into believing love meant never being held accountable? The guilt opened up in my chest like a sinkhole. I had enabled this. Every time I'd undermined David's authority, every time I'd slipped Michael money after David said no, every time I'd made excuses for behavior that deserved correction, I'd been teaching my son that his father's voice was optional. And when David finally put his foot down about something that mattered, when he refused to pretend theft was just a youthful mistake, Michael did exactly what I'd taught him to do. He left. And he expected me to choose sides. But this time, I hadn't chosen fast enough, hadn't chosen clearly enough, and the price was 10 years of silence that only death could break, and even then, only on one side. I gathered the letters carefully, arranging them back in chronological order, and noticed something I'd missed before. Tucked beneath the stack was a small leather journal, the kind David used for work notes and project lists. I opened it. The first page was dated 3 months after Michael left. The heading read, "Things I Should Have Said." My vision blurred as I began to read my husband's catalog of regrets, a father's desperate attempt to understand where love had curdled into estrangement. And with each word, I realized I didn't know the whole truth, not even close. The will was in a manila folder at the bottom of David's filing cabinet, tucked behind tax returns and insurance policies I'd never bothered to look at because David handled all of that. He was the organized one. The one who labeled files and kept receipts and made sure everything was in order, just in case. Just in case turned out to be a heart attack at 62 while trimming hedges on a Saturday morning. Diana had told me I needed to find it for the estate, for the lawyer, for all the practical reasons people need legal documents when someone dies. So 3 days after the funeral, I forced myself back into David's study and started searching. I found the will easily enough, but underneath it, paper clipped to the back page, was something else. A handwritten letter on yellow legal paper, dated 12 years ago. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. To whom it may concern. This statement concerns an incident involving my son, Michael David Clinton, and the family hardware store Clinton & Sons Hardware, established 1987. My stomach dropped. On March 15th, I discovered that approximately $3,200 had been taken from the store's safe over a period of 6 weeks. After reviewing the security footage and reconciling the books, I confirmed that Michael had accessed the safe on multiple occasions using the spare key from my office. When confronted, Michael admitted to taking the money. He claimed he needed it for personal expenses and intended to pay it back. I offered him a simple choice: work off the debt over the summer with no legal consequences, or face charges for theft. He called me a tyrant and left. He has not returned. I am writing this not to prosecute my son, but to document the truth in case he ever claims otherwise. I loved him enough to give him a second chance. He loved his pride more than he loved his family. David Clinton. The paper slipped from my hands and drifted to the floor. $3,200. 6 weeks of theft. And a father who'd offered mercy instead of punishment. I sat frozen, my mind racing backward through a decade of Michael's version of events, the version I'd swallowed whole because it was my son telling it, and what mother wants to believe her child is a liar? "He kicked me out," Michael had said, voice shaking with righteous anger during that awful phone call a month after he'd left. "Over nothing, Mom. Over me trying to live my own life. He's a control freak who can't stand that I'm not his perfect little soldier anymore." "What happened, sweetheart?" I'd asked, desperate to understand, desperate to fix it. "It doesn't matter. He made his choice. Either you're on his side or you're on mine." But he'd never told me about the money, never mentioned the theft, the confrontation, the choice David had offered him. He'd rewritten history, painted himself as the victim and his father as the villain, and I'd believed him because the alternative was too painful. The alternative was admitting my son was a thief and a liar. I thought back to that time, how Michael had suddenly moved out, how he'd stopped coming by, how he'd avoided family dinners and made excuses every holiday. How David had gone quiet and withdrawn, spending longer hours at the store, coming home exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. "Give him space," David had said when I'd begged him to fix it, to reach out, to apologize for whatever had driven Michael away. "He needs to come to terms with his choices." "What choices?" I demanded. "What happened between you two?" "He knows what he did." That was all David would say. And I'd been so angry at him for his stubbornness, his refusal to bend, his inability to just forgive whatever teenage rebellion had caused the rift. But it wasn't rebellion. It was theft, betrayal. And when caught, instead of accepting accountability, Michael had burned the bridge and blamed his father for the fire. I pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to stop the tears, but they came anyway, hot and bitter, and full of a grief that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with blindness. How many times had I secretly blamed David? How many times had I thought, if only he weren't so hard on Michael? If only he could let things go? If only he loved his son more than his principles? But David had loved Michael enough to protect him from legal consequences, loved him enough to offer a path to redemption, loved him enough to keep the truth from me so I wouldn't have to choose between them. And Michael had repaid that love with a decade of silence and a lie I'd carried like truth. I picked up the paper from the floor, reading it again, and felt something crack open inside me, not grief this time, but rage. Michael's apartment was on the 14th floor of a building with a doorman who looked at me like I might be lost. Glass and steel, minimalist furniture. A view of the city skyline that probably cost more per month than David and I had paid for our mortgage. I stood in the hallway outside his door, David's letter folded in my purse, and tried to remember the last time I'd been here. 3 years ago? 4? Michael never invited me. I always had to ask. I knocked. When he opened the door, there was a flash of something in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or annoyance, before his face settled into polite neutrality. "Mom." He didn't move to hug me. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." He glanced over his shoulder like he was checking for witnesses, then stepped aside. "You should have called first." The apartment was exactly as cold as I'd imagined. White walls, black leather sofa, a glass coffee table with nothing on it except a remote control positioned at a perfect right angle, no photos, no warmth, no evidence that a human being with a history actually lived here. "Can I get you something to drink?" Michael asked, already walking toward the kitchen. His tone was the one you'd use for a client, not your mother. "No, thank you." I sat on the edge of the sofa, my purse clutched in my lap. "I wanted to talk to you about your father." His back stiffened. "There's nothing to talk about. Michael, he's dead. He's gone. And you couldn't even—" I told you how I felt. He turned around, leaning against the granite counter with his arms crossed. He was wearing expensive jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than David's funeral suit. "I'm not going to pretend to mourn someone who stopped being my father a long time ago." "He never stopped being your father," my voice cracked. "He just stopped letting you get away with—" "With what?" Michael's eyes flashed. "With having my own opinions? With not wanting to spend my life running a dusty hardware store in a town that's dying?" He wanted to control every aspect of my life, and when I finally stood up for myself, he kicked me out. "That's not what happened." "Yes, it is." I pulled the letter from my purse and held it up. "I found this. In his will. He documented everything, Michael. The money you stole, the choice he gave you, the lies you've been telling for 10 years. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe. Or fear. But then it hardened into something uglier. So he wrote down his version of events. Congratulations. The man who always had to be right made sure he'd be right even after he died. $3,000, Michael. From the family business. That's not aversion, that's theft. I was going to pay it back. He gave you the chance to. He offered to let you work it off. No police, no lawyers, nothing on your record. And you called him a tyrant and walked out. Michael laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made my chest ache. Of course that's how he framed it. The generous father offering mercy to his ungrateful son. Did he mention how he humiliated me? How he made me feel like a criminal in front of the staff? How every single day of my childhood was about living up to his impossible standards? He had standards because he loved you. He had standards because he needed to control everything. Michael's voice rose. Do you know what it's like growing up with a father who treats every mistake like a moral failure? Who makes you feel like you're never good enough no matter what you do? That's not fair. He destroyed my confidence. He destroyed my future. Everything I've built, I built despite him, not because of him. I looked around the apartment, at the expensive emptiness, at the life my son had constructed out of pride and bitterness and lies. He'd told himself so many times he believed them. "Your father forgave you," I said quietly. "I found letters he wrote you. 20 of them. He spent 10 years trying to find the courage to reach out, trying to apologize for being too hard on you, trying to—" "Oh, please." Michael's laugh was cruel. "He wrote letters he never sent? How brave, how touching. Let me guess, he was too proud to actually mail them? He was too afraid you'd reject him. Good. He should have been afraid. He earned that." Something inside me went very still. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and realized I was staring at a stranger. The boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms was gone. The teenager who'd cried in my arms after his first heartbreak was gone. In their place stood a man whose pride had calcified into something impenetrable, who'd built his entire identity around a narrative of victimhood that absolved him of every mistake. "He paid off your debts," I said softly. "After you left. When your business failed. He paid them quietly so you wouldn't lose everything." Michael's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." We stared at each other across the vast, cold space of his apartment. I waited for something: remorse, gratitude, even anger. Anything human. Instead, he said, "You should go." I stood up, my legs shaking. "He loved you until the day he died, and you'll have to live with that." I walked to the door. Michael didn't follow me. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard him say, almost too quietly to hear, "He should have told me himself." But when I turned around, the door was already closing. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was washing dishes that didn't need washing, just something to do with my hands, something to fill the silence that had become the soundtrack of my life. "Mrs. Clinton? This is Robert Ventura. I worked with your husband at the store." I knew Robert. Tall man with kind eyes who'd been David's assistant manager for 15 years. He'd come to the funeral, shaken my hand, told me David was the best boss he'd ever had. "Of course, Robert. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you." He paused, and I heard him take a breath like he was steadying himself. "I'm calling because there's something I think you should know about David and Michael." My hand tightened on the phone. "Go on." "About 7 years ago, maybe 8, Michael started a business, some kind of tech startup, I think. David never talked about it much, but I could tell he was worried. He'd get these calls at work, and afterward, he'd just sit in his office staring at spreadsheets. I remembered that time. David had been distracted, distant. I'd asked him what was wrong, and he'd said it was just stress from the store, from suppliers raising prices, from the usual challenges of keeping a small business afloat in an age of big-box retailers. "Michael's company went under," Robert continued. "Failed within a year, but before it did, he'd racked up significant debt, business loans, credit cards, money borrowed from investors who expected returns. I don't know all the details, but I know he was facing lawsuits, possibly bankruptcy." My throat constricted. "How do you know this?" "Because David asked me to help him liquidate some assets. Quietly. He sold his share of the fishing cabin he co-owned with his brother. He cashed in some investments. He even took out a second mortgage on your house." "What?" The word came out strangled. "I'm sorry. I thought you knew. He made me promise not to tell anyone, especially not you. Said it would only upset you." The kitchen tilted slightly. I gripped the counter, soap suds dripping from my hand onto the floor. "How much?" $48,000, give or take. The number landed like a physical blow. $48,000. Our retirement savings. The cabin David loved, where he'd taught Michael to fish, where we'd spent summer weekends grilling and watching the sunset over the lake. The security we'd spent 30 years building. Gone. He paid Michael's debts. It wasn't a question. Every single one. Made sure the creditors were satisfied, the lawsuits dropped. Michael walked away clean. And David never told him, never asked for repayment, never even mentioned it. I sank into a chair, my legs unable to hold me anymore. "Why are you telling me this now?" Robert's voice softened. "Because I saw Michael wasn't at the funeral, and I heard through the grapevine he's been telling people his father ruined his business, sabotaged his chances. I couldn't let that stand, Mrs. Clinton. Not when I know the truth. David gave up everything to save that boy. worked double shifts to rebuild what he'd spent, never complained, never asked for gratitude. He mortgaged our house. I was still trying to process it. He could have lost everything. He did lose everything that mattered. He lost his son. But he made sure Michael didn't lose his future. After Robert hung up, I sat in the kitchen for an hour, maybe longer, watching the sunlight move across the floor. I thought about all the times I'd wondered why David worked such long hours in his final years, why he'd sold the cabin and told me it was because we were getting too old to maintain it, why he'd canceled our anniversary trip to Charleston, saying business was tight and we needed to be practical. He'd been practical, all right. Practical enough to sacrifice his own comfort, his own dreams, to protect a son who hated him for it. David's sternness hadn't been cruelty, it had been discipline born from love. His silence hadn't been pride, it had been mercy. He'd let Michael believe his business failed on its own, rather than reveal the truth, that even in rejection, even in hatred, a father's love doesn't stop giving. I walked back to David's study and opened the journal I'd found days before, flipped through pages of regrets and second-guessing until I found an entry dated 8 years ago, right around the time Michael's business collapsed. I don't regret helping him. I regret that he'll never know I did. But maybe that's what fatherhood is, loving someone even when they can't love you back, even when they don't want to. Maybe especially then. I pressed the journal to my chest and wept, not from grief this time, but from a fierce, aching pride. My husband had been a better man than anyone knew. Better than Michael deserved. Better than I'd given him credit for. I found it tucked inside David's copy of Lonesome Dove, the book he'd read 3 times, the one with the cracked spine and dog-eared pages, and his notes scribbled in the margins about honor and loyalty and what it means to be a good man. An envelope. Cream-colored. My name written across the front in his careful handwriting. Elena. Not Mrs. Clinton or my love or any of the endearments he'd used in birthday cards and anniversary notes. Just my name, simple and direct, the way David said things when they mattered most. My hands shook as I opened it. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all the ways I failed you. But mostly I'm sorry for the burden I'm leaving behind, the weight of our son's anger, and the question of whose fault it is. I need you to know something. It's not yours. You did everything right. You loved Michael with a fullness I could never match. You softened my edges when they needed softening. You built bridges I was too proud or too afraid to build myself. If there's a heaven, and if they're keeping score, you win by a mile. But here's what I learned too late. Some people don't want bridges. Some people need their anger more than they need reconciliation, because anger is easier than accountability. Michael is one of those people. And the tragedy isn't that he hates me, it's that his hatred is costing him the life he could have lived. I've spent 10 years trying to figure out what I did wrong, what I could have said differently, what moment I could go back and fix. But the truth is, Elena, I can't love someone into forgiving me. Neither can you. So here's what I'm asking, my love. If Michael never forgives me, promise me you'll forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for not fixing what was never yours to fix. Forgive yourself for loving a son who can't love you back the way you deserve. Forgive yourself for being human in a situation that required you to be perfect. You did your best. I watched you do your best every single day of our marriage, and your best was extraordinary. Live freely, Elena. Don't let his anger define your remaining years. Don't let guilt about choices you didn't make steal the joy you've earned. You were an incredible mother. You are an incredible woman. And you deserve peace. I love you. I loved you from the moment I met you at that ridiculous church potluck where you brought 3 casseroles because you couldn't decide which recipe was better. I loved you through every hard season, every joyful morning, every ordinary Tuesday that made up the beautiful life we built together. If Michael comes back, and I hope he does, for his sake tell him I forgave him the moment he walked out the door. Tell him I never stopped being his father, even when he stopped being my son. But if he doesn't come back, don't wait for him. Live, my love. Live fully. Live freely. That's all I ever wanted for both of you. Yours always, David. I read it 3 times before the words blurred completely. The house was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked. Life continued the way it always does, indifferent to the fact that my world was cracking open and reforming into something new. David had given me permission to let go. No more than permission. A command, a final act of love from a man who'd spent his life protecting me, even from truths I needed to hear. I sat in his chair, holding the letter against my chest, and felt something shift inside me. The guilt I'd been carrying that maybe I could have done more, said something different, chosen better, began to loosen its grip. I'd done my best. David said so, and David didn't lie. But there was still Michael. Michael, who'd built his entire identity around resentment. Michael, who'd rather cling to his victim story than face the truth of his father's love. Michael, who still didn't know the depth of sacrifice that had been made on his behalf. I thought about Robert's phone call. The $48,000, the mortgage David had taken out to save a son who blamed him for everything. Should I tell him? Should I honor David's silence and let Michael keep his comfortable lies? Or should I shatter those lies one final time and let the truth do what it would? David had asked me to live freely, but I couldn't live freely carrying secrets that weren't mine to keep. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady for the first time in weeks. I would tell Michael everything. Not because I expected it to change him, but because truth deserved to be spoken, even to ears that refused to hear it. And after that, after I'd honored both David's memory and my own conscience, I would finally, mercifully, let go. I dialed his number at 3 p.m. on a Thursday, not because the time mattered, but because I'd stopped waiting for the perfect moment. There were no perfect moments left. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice clipped with the irritation of someone interrupted. "Mom, what is it?" No preamble, no warmth, just the transactional tone he'd perfected over a decade of distance. "I need to tell you some things," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "About your father. Things you don't know." A sigh crackled through the line. "Mom, we've been through this. Your business failed 8 years ago, the tech startup. You faced lawsuits, bankruptcy. I didn't let him interrupt. Your father paid your debts. Every single one. $48,000. Silence. He sold the cabin you used to fish at together. He took out a second mortgage on our house. He worked double shifts for years to rebuild what he'd spent." My voice trembled slightly, but I pushed forward. "He never told you because he didn't want you to feel obligated. He just wanted you to have a future." Michael's voice was tight. "That's not what happened." "Yes, it is. I spoke with Robert Ventura. I found the documentation. Your father's assistant manager confirmed everything. You're rewriting history." The words came out harsh, defensive. "You're trying to make him into some kind of saint because you can't accept that he wrote you letters, Michael. 20 of them over 10 years. Apologizing, reaching out, hoping you'd come back." I closed my eyes, David's words echoing in my memory. "He documented what happened with the money you stole, $3,000 from the store safe. He gave you a choice, work it off or face charges. You chose pride instead." "Stop." His voice cracked slightly. "Just stop. He loved you until the day he died. He forgave you the moment you walked out, and he spent his last years protecting you from consequences you never even knew existed." The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve to know the truth, and I deserve to stop carrying it alone." "The truth?" Michael's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Your truth, his truth, never mine." "Michael." The line went dead. I set the phone down carefully on David's desk and waited for the tears to come. For the familiar ache of rejection, the urge to call back, to explain better, to try harder. But nothing came. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in 10 years. Lightness. As though David himself had reached down and lifted the weight from my shoulders, whispering the words from his letter, "Live freely." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with cream-colored stationery, the expensive kind David had given me last Christmas that I'd been saving for something important. This was important. "Dear Michael, I've said everything I needed to say. The rest is yours to carry or release. When you're ready to see truth, not my truth or your father's, but the truth that lives beyond pride and pain, you'll find me in peace. I will always be your mother, but I will no longer be your apologist. With love, Mom." I sealed the envelope, wrote his address in careful script, and placed it on the counter beside my purse. Tomorrow I would mail it. Tonight, I would finally sleep. The coastal town was called Mercy Point, though I didn't choose it for the name. I chose it because David and I had spent a weekend here 30 years ago, back when Michael was 3 and still small enough to carry on his father's shoulders. We'd walked this same pier at sunset, eating ice cream that dripped onto our hands, and David had said, "When we retire, let's come back here. Just you and me." We never made it back together, but I made it back for him. The cottage I rented was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen with windows that faced the water, a porch just wide enough for a rocking chair, and a pot of geraniums. It was nothing like the house David and I had filled with 35 years of memories. Nothing like the home where I'd raised a son who no longer spoke to me. It was perfect. Every morning, I woke to the sound of gulls and salt air. I made coffee in a blue ceramic mug I'd bought at the local thrift store. Not because I needed a new mug, but because it felt like claiming something that belonged only to this new version of my life. Then I walked to the pier with a journal tucked under my arm, the one with "Letters Never Sent" written across the cover in my own handwriting. I wrote to David mostly. Small things. "The sunrise was coral and gold today. You would have loved it." Or, "I saw a father teaching his daughter to fish. She caught a tiny perch and screamed with joy, and I thought of you and Michael at Lake Marion." Sometimes I wrote to Michael too, though those letters were harder. "I wonder if you've opened my envelope yet. I wonder if you ever will." Or, "Today I realized I'm no longer angry." I don't know when that happened, but it did. The rose bush I planted outside my bedroom window had taken root faster than I'd expected. 11 blooms so far, 1 for each year since Michael walked away. I watered it every evening, watching the petals unfold like small acts of defiance against loss. 11 years, I whispered to the bush one twilight evening, my fingers brushing the velvet softness of a bloom. 11 years of silence, but here you are, still growing. 6 months into my new life, on an evening when the sky burned orange and the waves rolled in, gentle and steady, I walked to the end of the pier with a single white rose. I'd bought it that morning from the flower shop on Main Street, the one run by a woman named Grace, who never asked questions, just smiled and wrapped stems in brown paper tied with twine. I stood at the railing, holding the rose between my palms, and thought about everything I'd learned in the months since David died, about sacrifice that goes unwitnessed, about love that survives rejection, about the difference between holding on and holding space. "He may have died to Michael 10 years ago," I whispered to the wind, to the water, to whatever part of David still existed in the world beyond this one. "But he'll live in me forever." I released the rose. It floated for a moment on the surface, white against the darkening blue, then drifted slowly toward the horizon. I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled not from happiness exactly, but from something deeper. Peace, the kind that comes not from having what you want, but from accepting what remains. Love survives, even when relationships don't. David had taught me that. Even in death, even in silence, even in the empty space where a son should have been, love remained. Not because it was returned, but because it was real. I turned from the pier and walked back toward my cottage, where a light burned in the window and the rose bush waited to bloom again. Thank you for watching to the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because the next story isn't just intriguing, it's unforgettable. You'll love it.